Hi everyone, it's really good to see you again. I hope you're doing okay in another week of lockdown. But don't fear, Super Purple Girl is here again this week to look at another bit from the Book of Judges. Please do use the PDF with other games and activities, and we hope you enjoy the video. Oh no, I was just doing my workouts. See, Happy Easter everyone. Who isn't enjoying eggs? Yummy. Although, I don't think they're helping me with my strength training. Well, I'm hoping to become the strongest superhero. I wonder which superhero you think is the strongest. Let's play a bit of a game together. Now at home, I want you to think of 5 to 10 of your favourite superheroes. And then I want you to rate them from the strongest to the weakest. Well, it's that time again. It's time for my mission assignment to arrive. Oh! Here it is. Let's find out what my assignment is today. What makes superheroes strong? Well, I hope Easter eggs will make me strong because I wasn't doing very well with my workout. But I guess over the last few weeks in the Book of Judges, we've met 3 different judges. Can you remember who they were? First we had Othniel, then we had Ehud, and last week we met Deborah. Well, this week we're going to meet someone who is known as the Mighty Warrior. So, what I want you to do, grab a pen and a bit of paper, and in 30 seconds, I want you to try and draw what you think a mighty warrior would look like. Well, here's my drawing. This is my mighty warrior. Look, he's got really big muscles and a 14 pack because he's really strong. He's got a cool haircut, so he's more aerodynamic and go fast, and he's even got wings on his feet, so he can go really fast. I wonder what yours looks like. Well, in the story today, let's have a read and see what the mighty warrior really is like. But on your picture, I want you, as we look at the story, to write down the things that you think make the warrior we meet in the Bible a mighty warrior. And if there's anything that makes him look a bit wimpy, why don't you write that down too, maybe in a different colour. Let's look at the story together.
Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press, which made it very hard to get the wheat, but he was scared the Midianites would come and steal his food. When suddenly the angel of the Lord came and sat nearby an oak tree and said,
"The Lord is with you, mighty warrior."
Pardon me, but if the Lord is with us, why is all this happening?
Go out in the strength that you have and defeat all the Midianites.
How am I to save Israel? My clan is the least of Manasseh, and I'm from the least of the families.
I will be with you, and you will defeat the Midianites.
If you are really with us, Lord, please give me a sign.
Gideon went and prepared a meal to give as an offering, which he brought and put on a rock. The angel touched it with their staff, and fire came and consumed it. Gideon was very afraid and said,
Alas, sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face.
But the angel replied,
Peace, do not be afraid, you will not die.
The angel tells Gideon to go and break down the altars to false gods that are nearby.
Okay.
And that night, because Gideon was scared someone might see him, Gideon goes down with 10 of his servants and destroys them, as the Lord said. But the next morning the townspeople see that the altar has been destroyed, and they are angry and say, Who did this? They find out it was Gideon. But Gideon's dad persuades them not to attack Gideon. Surely the false gods could get Gideon back if they wanted to. The Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet and gathered an army together, and they followed him. He had an army ready to fight. But before that, he wanted to ask God for another sign to be sure this was what God wanted. He said to the Lord,
If you will save Israel through me, then make the fleece I put on the floor wet and the ground around it dry. Then I'll know it was true.
So that was what Gideon did. And the next day he found the ground dry and that he could squeeze a bowl full of water out of the fleece. Gideon said to God again,
This time, so I can be sure, make the fleece dry, but the ground wet.
And the next day he found it like that.
Wow.
The next morning, with the army camped nearby, God said, You have too many men. They will think they've won because they're strong, and not because I have saved them. So get rid of anyone who is scared.
Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back.
Sir, yes, sir!
About 22,000 men left, and 10,000 remained. But this was still too many. The Lord said to Gideon to get rid of more. Watch how they drink, and this will separate those who remain. Some kneel to drink, whilst others cup their hands and lap the water using their tongues like dogs. God said to Gideon to send those who kneeled down home, but those who cupped the water and drank like dogs could stay to fight. Gideon now had just 300 men. That night, God spoke to Gideon and said, If you're afraid, go down to the enemy camp and listen. You will be encouraged. Gideon heard someone speak about their dream, and their dream meant Gideon was going to attack the camp and destroy them. Gideon said,
Get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands.
And he divided them into 3 groups. Gideon gave each man a trumpet and an empty jar with a torch inside. Gideon said to them,
Watch me and follow my lead. Do exactly as I do. When we get to the edge of the camp, and I and my men blow our trumpets, blow your trumpets, and shout, For the Lord and for Gideon.
Gideon crept down to the camp, and when he saw it was the right time, he blew his trumpet. The other soldiers had gathered all around the camp, and they heard him, and then blew their trumpets, and smashed their jars, and shouted, A sword for the Lord and for Gideon! Gideon and his soldiers stayed around the outside of the camp, but the Midianites ran around crying as they fled. They were so confused they even attacked each other. Other Israelites joined in and helped fight the Midianites, and Gideon chased them, and eventually they had fought and destroyed all the Midianites. The Israelites asked Gideon to be their king, But Gideon said,
I will not rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. But you can give me an earring.
Gideon used the gold earrings to make an ephod, which was the clothing the priests wore, and people would go to see Gideon and his ephod instead of to God. Gideon also had a son, whom he called Abimelech, which means, my father is king.
Well, did you think Gideon was a mighty warrior? Or was he a mighty wimp? Well, let's have a look at what the Bible said, and let's see what you wrote down and see if you think he's a mighty warrior or a mighty wimp. Well, it begins with Gideon hiding in a wine press. That's a bit wimpish, isn't it? Hiding from the enemy when maybe he should be out fighting them. So that's not good. And when God tells him to go, he says, "Me? I'm one of the weakest in my family, and my clan is the weakest in Manasseh." So far, he's looking a bit like a mighty wimp. And it doesn't get better. Do you remember he asked for a sign? He asked to make that offering to the angel of the Lord to prove that it really was God speaking to him. And when he gets the sign, he's terrified again. But what happens next does make him look like a mighty warrior. God tells him to go and break down the Asherah pole and the false god's altar. And he does. He goes and destroys it with 10 of his servants. But he does do it at night. And we're told that's because he's scared of the townspeople and how his family would react. So he does look a bit like a mighty warrior, but he is also a mighty wimp. Well, what happens next? Well, he goes and gathers the army. He's looking brave, he's looking like a mighty warrior. But just before he's about to gather them to go into battle, he asks God for a sign. He does that thing with the fleece, asking for it to be wet and the ground to be dry, and then the next night the other way round, because he wants to be really sure that this is God sending him. God then sends him not with his army that starts off with 32,000 men, but just with 300. Can you imagine going to fight a massive battle with just 300 when you could have had 32,000? Well, Gideon looks like a mighty warrior then. Going and he manages to defeat the Midianites. He even, with his battle strategy, gets them to attack themselves. Gideon certainly is looking like a mighty warrior there. And he continues on and does defeat the enemy's kings. And God's people have peace in the land. Although, at the end, remember Gideon takes those earrings and makes an ephod, which is the priest's clothing, and he uses that to not bring people to God, but it ends up distracting them and they forget God more. And then he says, "No, I won't be king because God is your king." And yet he names his son, "My father is king." At the end, he seems to get a bit confused and he stops acting like a mighty warrior. My mission this week was to look at what makes superheroes strong. Well, with Gideon, he doesn't look that strong. In some ways, well, a lot of ways, he's a mighty wimp. But he does go and fight the battles that God tells him to. And so he does become the mighty warrior the angel of the Lord declares him to be at the beginning. But what was it that made Gideon strong? What helped him to be a mighty warrior in those moments? Well, it was because he remembered that he had a mighty God with him. Just like Deborah had said, "The Lord is our rescuer." Gideon knows that the Lord is the true king. The Lord is the one who was with him, helping him in those battles. And so Gideon is a mighty warrior because of his mighty God. That's what makes him strong. But Gideon gets it wrong towards the end. God's people ask him to be their king. He says, "No, the Lord is your king." But then he takes their gold, he gets rich, he makes the ephod, and people start worshipping that instead of God. And then he names his son, "My Father is King." He seems to get a bit confused, and he doesn't end up helping the people. He ends up leading them away from God. Each judge that we've seen so far has reminded us about Jesus. Sometimes we look at the judge, see how amazing they are, and that reminds us how amazing Jesus is. But today, particularly, we see how rubbish Gideon is. But that shows us how unlike Jesus he is. So let's have a look at that now. Most of the time, Gideon looked like a massive, mighty wimp. He looked weak. He wasn't a strong leader that would lead his people into victory. But he does end up doing that. Jesus looked weak too. He was so weak that he was put on a cross as a criminal and he died. Jesus looked weak. But through that, Jesus won the victory. Through that, Jesus was the mightiest. He even came back to life to prove how mighty he was. Gideon in the story is often reluctant. He needs God to reassure him with signs again and again. And often he's scared. Now, Jesus is different. Jesus isn't reluctant about going to the cross. Jesus is willing and determined. In the Gospels, we often read about Jesus making sure he was on his way to Jerusalem. And this is what it says in the book of Hebrews. It says, "For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and he sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." It was because of joy that Jesus went to the cross. Gideon was a reluctant mighty warrior, but Jesus was a joyous one. He wanted to go to the cross to save you and to save me. Gideon said he didn't want to be king, but then he ended up acting like a king and making a mess of things. Jesus came and he didn't look like a king, even though he was the true king of the whole universe. Jesus didn't look kingly at all. He wasn't born in a palace, he was born in a stable. He came to serve, not to be served. And he ended up being put on a cross and crowned with thorns. Jesus is the best king. He's the best ruler. And he's the king that dies for us to save us. And he's the king that comes back to life to rule and reign and to be with us. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Surprising Superheroes. Do tune in again next week for the next episode of Surprising Superheroes. And we hope you enjoyed the activities on the PDF and have a great week.